Hello and welcome to the Mapping the Doctrine of Discovery podcast. The producers of this podcast would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And now, introducing your hosts, Phil Arnold and Sandy Bigtree.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Mapping the Doctrine of Discovery. My name is Phil Arnold. I'm faculty member in the Religion Department at Syracuse University, core faculty member in Native American Indigenous Studies, and the founding director of the Scano Great Law Peace Center.
And I'm Sandy Bigtree, a citizen of the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne. I'm on the board of the Indigenous Values Initiative and the academic collaborative of the Scano Center.
This podcast, this whole series, is sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation, and we're greatly appreciative of Henry Luce Foundation and their continued support of this work in the doctrine of discovery. Today, we're going to have a conversation with an old friend who I went to graduate school with in the University of Chicago, Divinity School, Winifred Sullivan, or Winnie, as we know her. Winnie, I'll let you introduce yourself, but first I just want to say a couple of things that I remember. Winnie was one of those amazing grad students that you always wanted to emulate. As I recall, you had already gone through law school and at some point were a practicing lawyer there in Chicago and decided you wanted to go back and do a PhD in religion. And so you're just kind of the perfect person to give us a really kind of wide look at the role of law and religion and those relationships, culturally speaking. But really a pleasure to see you here today. But why don't you introduce yourself, where you are now, and what you're doing?
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Sandy. So I teach at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, which is a large public university in the middle of the country with a large religious studies department. I'm also affiliated with the law school, and I run a center called the Center for Religion and the Human. And I've been at Indiana for 12 years.
Thanks for that. Maybe we could just start there. So can you, as a lawyer, or a lawyer at one time, and an academic in the academic study of religion, someone who is steeped in those different kind of disciplines, can you talk about your new Center of Religion and the Human and how that's connected to your work in religion and law?
Sure. And maybe I'll start by saying that we also have the Henry Luce Foundation to thank. Our center, the Center for Religion and the Human, began 5 years ago with a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. And so we're enormously grateful to their support of our work. And it comes out of the work, the grant to our center, an insight by Jonathan Van Antwerpen at the Luce Foundation that public universities were a very important place in which to have a conversation about religion, about religious freedom, about religion in public life, and that they were, in a way, very well suited to such a conversation. We think of what we do at the center as teaching religion in public. That is, we are, all employees of the state of Indiana, and we regard our work as public work on behalf of the people of Indiana. We teach students largely from schools, high schools all over Indiana, and we think it's a wonderful place to teach religion, a very open conversation that needs to take into account many, many perspectives and find ways to articulate what we do and talk about religion in a way that's accessible to everyone. So this is something we pride ourselves on. The center comes out of an insight. The original founders of the center were Lisa Sedaris, who's now at the University of California at Santa Barbara, who's an environmental ethicist, Constance Fury, who's an early modern scholar at IU, and myself. And the notion was that given the many contexts that we all live in, and this was before the pandemic in some ways, and recent wars and crises have deepened this context, that we live in a time when what it means to be human is of particular interest because of climate change, because of social and political conflict, because of the pressure on the human from technology and the opening to the non-human, to the natural world, to animals, is creating a situation in which the human is a question today, is our where we start from. And it is our argument that the human is essentially a religious question in a very broad sense. So here I use religion in the broadest sense. Maybe I'll say a couple more things about our center. Hosts a number of different projects, but what really they all have in common is that they're all collaborative. We believe very strongly in collaborative work. And so much of what our center does is to bring together different voices around different topics. Yeah, I could go and I could talk more about the different projects, but maybe that's enough of an introduction for now.
That's fascinating. Boy, I wish New York State would get this memo. I mean, it's always been a difficulty for our students really to crack into SUNY schools for some reason or another, because it's always viewed with suspicion, right? That you're teaching religion at a public university would smack of certain kind of violation of the dividing line between church and state. But then you're in a red state that you're able to do these kinds of investigations in a more kind of, expansive way on religion and the human. I mean, that's just fascinating what you've sort of developed there at IA.
Yeah, I think there isn't, naturally there are those who are uncomfortable with talking about religion in a public university, but this department has been strong for, a very long time. And I think in a way it sells itself. When I first came here 12 years ago to be the chair, I would meet people on campus from every department and they say, "Oh, the religion department, that's a great department."
Wow.
Everybody knew it. And it's interesting. So we, in a way, made our own argument for ourselves. But I think partly one of the advantages of a public university, at least in our department, is that our department was never a seminary. There was never the sort of Bible theology, church history. We study and teach all the religions of the world and the peoples of the world through time and space. There's no remnant really of that version of religious studies here.
Yeah.
In this part of the country, being so close to Onondaga and upholding their ancient traditions, they've not been, violated by the U.S. into how they, live. It's a stark awareness coming into this area and trying to use the term religion. Phil recently published his book on the urgency of Indigenous values, because working with the Haudenosaunee, it's very difficult to have this collaboration when you're talking about the category of religion, because religion played such a key role in undermining, trying to completely obliterate who we understood ourselves to be as human. It's really changed the way, Phil's done his work and how I do my work too.
Yeah.
I think that's very present with us as well. Of course, there are Native communities in Indiana as well, with whom we're working. We have a new Indigenous Studies program at Indiana, and actually in the center, our newest initiative is a Being Human Indigenously project. So very much in conversation across those old divides. Not in any way to discount what you say, Sandy. For sure, the category of religion as a legal category as well as an intellectual category has been very problematic. I think there are ways in which it can still be useful. I'm not one of those who would completely ban it. I think it's often problematic to just ban words, but I think that history has to come with it for sure. And I respect those for whom the word remains too problematic.
Yeah, this really isn't about my book, but I did want to update history of religions, right? I kind of wanted to challenge it a bit. I don't want to ban religion by any means. I have admiration for those who taught us at, the Div School at University of Chicago. And I want to be able to utilize those ideas that I learned there, was inspired by, and bring it into a conversation with, indigenous peoples. So I think I think I'm with you on that. I don't want to ban religion, but on the category of religion, I do think we need to have a more sophisticated historical understanding of how it's been deployed. And in that regard, Winnie, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, you're one of the foremost scholars on religion and law. And can you just talk us through some of those fundamental features of the American experience, of, on the one hand, freedom of and freedom from, and how you see religion and law operating in the world today?
And those are very big questions.
Yes, that's what we deal with here.
Maybe one thing I would say as a sort of amendment to what I just said is that I do think that I'm inclined to think that religion should not be used as a word in law. I think it can be used in academic and public conversations, but I don't think it has proved to be helpful as a legal category. So
say more about that.
Well, one of the distinctive things about the U.S., of course, is that the way religion appears in the U.S. Constitution, that the U.S. Constitution in its first form did not mention religion at all. Mm. And one of the reasons for that was that the U.S. Constitution was understood to be creating a government of limited competency, right? Of enumerated powers, but not plenary power. I would say that one of the things I've learned, I think that's most important, is how distinctive the U.S. is compared to Europe, for example, where most of the countries of Europe, most of the states of Europe, as modern secular states, democratic states, inherited their ideas of themselves, their sovereign power from kings, from the prior royal governments that governed them. And kings were understood to have all the power there was, right? Sovereign plenary power. And they also were understood to have a kind of paternal, in a good sense, care for their people. I mean, an obligation, whether they actually did it or not, but that right. there was understood that the best kings, virtuous kings, would care for their people. The U.S. is not that kind of state. It does not have, the United States federal government does not have plenary power. The sovereignty of the United States is understood to rest in the people, we the people, and originally had nothing to do with religion. A religion was not in the original plan because the federal government was only understood to have power over certain things that seemed necessary, treaty making with foreign powers, certain kinds of, the rest of the power was left to the states individually. But over time, and particularly since the Civil War, the federal government became more powerful, more and more powerful. And what happened with religion, and it's hard to tell this in a brief way because it's a complicated story. In order to get the Constitution, in order to come into effect, had to be confirmed by each of the original colonies, the 13 colonies. And the politics of that campaign led to people saying, well, you have nothing in this Constitution that says that the federal government, can't do certain things to citizens. There's nothing about the rights of citizens in this Constitution. And the answer of people like James Madison was, we don't need to have those in there because the federal government has no power over those things, so we don't need to mention them because that's all left to the states. But it was impossible to have the Constitution be confirmed without adding in those 10 amendments that we think of as the Bill of Rights. So that was a political accommodation, right, which was regarded as basically unnecessary by the others who said, this is not the business of the federal government. We'll put this in here, but they don't have that that's not their job, right? And so the two clauses, the Free Exercise Clause and the No Establishment Clause, are addressed to Congress. Congress shall have no power, and they are addressed to the federal government.
Right.
So in a way, they're what we would call jurisdictional in their original form. They were just saying the federal government has no authority over religion. All of that was left to the states. And so what happened is that then this gets complicated at the time of the Civil War with the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were passed after the Civil War to guarantee rights to the newly enfranchised enslaved persons, ban slavery and give the right to vote to formerly enslaved persons, and also to guarantee equal rights. What happened then between 1865 and the first third of the 20th century, as we all know, is that the promise of those amendments was not met. Yeah. Right? That through the resistance of the South and other parts of the country and entrenched racism and Jim Crow laws, in fact, African Americans were not given the rights that were. By the beginning of the 20th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, the pressure to enforce those amendments increased. And so, as we know, eventually you're going to get to Brown versus Board of Education and the kind of insistence on equality between African Americans and white Americans. Also, though, what happened is that when the Supreme Court finally gets to enforcing the 14th Amendment and the guarantee that of equal rights to all Americans, the question came up, well, what rights are these exactly?
Yeah.
And they said, oh, we have them listed in the Bill of Rights.
Right.
So over the first half of the 20th century, those various elements from the Bill of Rights get changed from just being federal to also being applied to the states. This is called the incorporation doctrine. So as a kind of literary legal matter, these various parts of the Bill of Rights get incorporated into the 14th Amendment such that the First Amendment no longer means, Congress shall make no law, but neither Congress nor the states shall make any law. So beginning in the middle of the 20th century, 1940, suddenly the Supreme Court gets in the business of deciding what religion is. And it comes about via the 14th Amendment and through what we still know is a deep tension in American constitutional life between states' rights and federal rights, between what is the matter of the states and what is the matter of the government. Up until then, issues around religion are decided state by state. And each state constitution has its own mini First Amendment. They're not all the same, but each one has its own constitution. And that's the main way in which religion gets governed in the US up until 1940, when it suddenly becomes nationalized. And that creates a new politics. This is a very complicated story, but
Fascinating.
it is very interesting. And Phil, from the point of view of those of us who did degrees in religious studies, or particularly for me in American religious studies, if you think about the religious makeup of the US at the end of the 18th century, when the Constitution was written, the people who were present in the US were Native Americans, African Americans, and mostly white Protestants, some Catholics, some Jews. But if you think about that demography then, and we could talk about religion and law then, although then we would be talking very much state by state.
Right.
Because different legal cultures in different states, different colonial histories at that point, very different colonial histories, different kinds of Protestants, right? But if you fast forward now to 1940, right, and 1950, which is when now we're talking about the Second World War, we've had massive immigration in the US from all over the world, really. And so now we have everybody. And so this word religion, which is what we started talking about, suddenly I think what happens is that it becomes completely inadequate as a way to think about how religious diversity, really complex religious diversity, might be accommodated, and how what we might call peaceable coexistence could work, because they're stuck with a word that meant something at the end of the 18th century. Most people understood what it meant. It doesn't mean it included everybody, but everybody knew what it meant, to a time when it was bewildering to the Supreme Court to have this word.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges that we all face, in religion departments, because it seems as if the media today knows exactly what religion means, but it's such a complicated history and complicated word. I mean, but I would like to go back to Johnson. Our conference last December was focused on Johnson v. McIntosh, and how the doctrine of discovery really enters U.S. law, right? Because interestingly, Marshall really doesn't talk about religion. I mean, just listening to you, even though he's drawing on Catholic theological principles from the 15th century, right? And really British colonial documents and justifications for colonialism, doesn't really talk about religion, talks about civilization, talks about this project, of the American project, and how then he incorporates the doctrine of discovery, or the discovery doctrine, as he calls it, into U.S. law. And I wonder then how that slots into your really important narrative about the problem of religion and U.S. law, or does it? I don't.
Well, you also have to consider that the hierarchical structure was in place in Europe, going from the line from popes to the monarchies, and then being transferred to England during the Reformation, and it became like European English law through the Cabot Charter. And so there's all these connections. Religion is embedded in these hierarchical structures of domination before they even come here. Then there's the glimmer of encountering Indigenous people here. And there's many orders that go to Europe, and they, like what you're saying, they observe, they're going, you talk about freedom, but you're only free under the umbrella of your monarch. you're not experiencing freedom. We experience freedom in the Americas or in our homelands. And then the founding fathers in the late 18th century, they're talking to the founding fathers how to structure, around their model of several entities unifying under this, the Haudenosaunee, and being
Great law of peace.
under the great law of peace. But it's a whole other structure. It's not hierarchical at all. So that opens up new possibilities for establishing a new form of governance, which has indigenous roots to this democracy that influenced the Western world.
So I think what you bring up is really, really important, Sandy, and staying for a moment with this at the end of the 18th century, this is, in spite of Marshall's really strong supremacist rhetoric,
Right.
the fact is, at that point, the U.S. is nothing, right? Yeah. I mean, this is, it doesn't have any power in the world at this point. And, what you point to, I think, Sandy, and I think this is actually in some ways weirdly evident in Marshall's opinion, far more than any later opinions, in the sense that Marshall does acknowledge that Native American peoples are peoples with governments, rights, ways of living in the land, ways of living with each other. He doesn't shrink them down to people who might have a religion or a this or that. He talks about, I don't know if you agree, but I think that's one of the strange things about the Johnson versus McIntosh opinion is that, he was a man of the frontier. He grew up in Western Virginia. He was not a cityfied guy, so he had some sense of the reality of the multiple governing structures and communities that existed at the time of the making of the Constitution.
As did many of the founding fathers, I'll say. Yeah.
Yes. And so I think this is really important to sit with because, as you say, Sandy, there was a possibility then. There were actually robust, coexisting robust structures for thinking about what it means to be human in community.
But more than community, these are nations. They're indigenous nations, and all the treaties were drawn up as nation-to-nation agreements, and it empowered the federal government when it's having all this separation of the state, like pulling away and trying to have find their own autonomy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and I think Marshall does not use the language of nations there, although other people did. And so.
Well, Constitution, it's the law of the land, right?
Absolutely. But I think that there's a way in which that is so much more real there than it's hard for Americans today to understand that or to see that. You bring up, Phil, the way the media uses religion today. Well, it's now, almost 100 years after the incorporation doctrine that I was talking about, the federalization, and 50 years, since I was in law school. The change to the word religion in public life in the U.S. is very dramatic in the last 30 years. The word has shrunk in meaning in ways, and I do think that there are ways strategically to try to recover or to maybe find a way to invest in this word as an alternative to certain highly secularist versions of what it means to be a human. And so for me, on the one hand, there is the media today in the U.S., which largely understands religion in a very binary way, so that the liberal media regards religion as being evangelical Protestants exclusively, and that makes it impossible to talk about anything what we have in common, in my view, other than neoliberalism. that's what we have in common. Unless we can expand our understanding of what it means to be human, I really worry.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, well, let's talk about that. You recently wrote this piece for the Marty Center on the immolation. What was the man's name? Aaron Bushnell, yeah. And you, at one point in the piece, you say, I argue that protest invokes real law founded in religious understandings of the human and of human community, as well as of conceptions of justice and culpability, law that rivals the claims of modern secularist law. I wondered if you can talk a little more about that, because I think in that you're challenging both categories in a way, religion and law, and what that means for the meaning of being human today.
So maybe for the hearers, I might just very briefly explain who Aaron Bushnell was. Aaron Bushnell was an American airman who was stationed near the District of Washington, D.C. And about 2.5 weeks ago, he set fire to himself outside the Israeli embassy, and he filmed himself. He live videotaped himself. On a Facebook post before he did this, he said the following. He said, "What would you do if your country was enforcing apartheid? What would you do if your country was enforcing legalized slavery? What would you do if your country was committing genocide?" And then the next sentence was, "You are doing it now." I found this very, very powerful. And then just before he set himself afire, he announced that he was protesting the genocide in Gaza, and that he was, and as he burned, he shouted, "Free Palestine." So many things have struck me about this event. First, it was not reported very much.
Right. I noticed, that you mentioned that. Which
I find kind of astonishing and scary. And there are many ways we could talk about that. But I think one of the ways, which I tried to address in my piece, was that I think people are scared. I mean, even people that we maybe don't have a political view of this, that people are scared by this kind of thing, but also they don't understand it. And one of the strange things about the video is that in the video, as he burns, you see a law enforcement officer holding a gun on him, pointed at him as he burns. So it's as if, and then there's another law enforcement officer comes up with a fire extinguisher. But in the way that that act has been written about, it seems both from the gun and other things that have been written in the press, that people assume either he was a terrorist or he was mentally ill. And that's been the main way that people have addressed it. Or for those who admire him, there's a sort of, he's an individual conscience. He's a single person who somehow has a sort of saintly conscience, and that's all you can say about this. For me, this was, and Phil, from history of religions, this is not something that is individual.
Right.
This is something that is communal. So I tried, and very importantly for me, it's legal. It is not just a question of conscience, but that what he was doing, and what other people who have done acts like this were doing, is making a legal claim on us, shifting the burden and on, of course, the Israeli government and the U.S. government, but also on us. And that there's a legal structure to what he does. This would be called in law a shifting of the burden of proof, that now it's on us. That's what he's done. And always for me now, and this is one of the projects we're doing in our center, is called Unstately Religion. Always we're interested in describing, lifting up. This connects, of course, to Sandy's earlier invocation of nations that preceded the U.S., that of alternative sovereignties and coexisting sovereignties. Always there is legal pluralism, always. If you listen to the nation states today, they act as if they have a monopoly on law and a monopoly on violence. They do not. They say they do, but they do not, ever. There's always multiple laws, and every individual is responsible to multiple legal orders. Sorry, I got a little bit preachy there.
No, that's great. I get a better sense of what you're talking about when you invoke law now. It's not plenary power of the state. Yes, it's that, but it's something else as well. I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about lately, or I've been talking about in my conquest class, is that Indigenous people do diversity really well. They understand diversity, and they have protocols that have been in place for millennia to deal with, another nation that's 100 miles that way, down, the path or through the woods or whatever. And there are all these protocols for other nations that will come. You receive them, it's what's called the edge of the wood ceremony for the Haudenosaunee. They brush them down. They acknowledge their difficulties, their struggles, that sort of thing. There's food, there's all kinds of but there's the acknowledgement that those nations have under their purview, their responsibilities are to those stories, right? They live in their places that have their own languages, their own customs, their own, their own ceremonial traditions that transact with other spiritual beings there. So there's always this acknowledgement of kind of radical plurality that's going on in indigenous nations. So, I mean, and that's one of the striking things when you're dealing with indigenous peoples, this tremendous plurality of different traditions and that sort of thing. Yeah.
But going back to the Haudenosaunee, the first treaty was with the Dutch in 1613, known as the Two-Row Wampum. And it's an agreement that shows like two rivers, so to speak, where the Dutch would be sailing on one and the Haudenosaunee would be in their canoe on the other, and they travel down the river of life without interference with one another and respecting each other, understanding of what the river of life means. So all got really lost in translation because the Haudenosaunee lived that way with their neighbors. They were welcoming to colonists coming in so everyone could cohabitate in a new existence. But you have to be in proper relationship with the natural world. And that just went right over their heads.
Yeah. Yeah. And
that's very deep, very deep part of the culture, understanding what it means to be human, because the natural world identifies each and every one of the Haudenosaunee as through their clan and who they are in relationship to the natural world.
And we have a kind of strange understanding of plurality or diversity, I guess, because when we're talking about diversity, we're not talking about this kind of level of radical diversity, or diversity of geographies or landscapes, right?
Right. Your identity comes from the land where you reside, and the land is diverse and it's ever changing, and the waters are always changing. And it's this regenerative energy that we're just part of. And when you go outside of it and start disrupting it, it's just going to create mayhem.
Yeah.
Do you need help catching up on today's topic? Or do you want to learn more about the resources mentioned? If so, please check our website at podcast.doctrineofdiscovery.org for more information. And if you like this episode, review it on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the conversation.
does that coincide with some idea of the human, or your reworking ideas of law, religion, and the human?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I hope you'll forgive me if I bring up my favorite subject right now, which is Joan of Arc.
Yeah, please.
I mean, my interest in Joan of Arc, I've been teaching her trial for many years. You know, Joan lived before the creation of the modern state.
Right.
She lived at the beginning of the 15th century. And my book is about her political theology, what I'm calling her political theology, but her ideas of governance, which I think have been obscured by the ways in which she became a figure for nationalism in the 19th century. But this was not the world she lived in. There was no France at the time of Joan's.
There was no Europe.
No. And what she sought was peace. What she sought was relief for the people of the French territories from the aristocratic wars that had been going on and ruining the land. Principally the war between England and France, but also there were civil wars involved. This was an aristocratic politics which was destroying the lives of ordinary people. She sought, a restoration of a place in which people could live. This is, in part what you're talking about, Sandy, an attention to the possibility for people living in peace, in community, caring for one another, at the level of the land and in places. One of my favorite discoveries was the day I realized that she wasn't French, that this is all myth making. So she came from on the edge of what now is France, but was not part of France then. And the voices she heard as a young girl said, "Go to France." And I don't know, I've been reading this for years. And finally I went, oh, right. She's not French. She's not in France. She went to France, which then was not anything like what we think of France today, but to the French court to help restore peace. And in a way, Sandy, you might say this is maybe a little fanciful. She went as a person, and she's often described as an illiterate peasant, as if she was brainless and just, a dumb girl. Her family were farmers, well-off farmers. They're very involved in local politics. She was a smarty pants girl who knew what was going on. And when she got to court, she knew what she was talking about. So she brings a very strong notion of what it means to live in peace and to be responsible to your neighbors and to your place. And probably she expected to go back there, but she gets captured and, as everybody knows, burned. But that's what they did. That wasn't what that was not her project. I sometimes get frustrated by people who only focus on her martyrdom and don't focus on her political project, which I think is much closer to what we're talking about, something that was still possible before the invention of the modern state.
That's interesting. Or she's mentally ill or something like that. She's just like a crazy person or something.
Women who are always
right. Hysterical.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But she's so smart. She's so funny. And she was really beloved by the soldiers that she led.
And evidently a threat,
She was a threat to the English for sure. They were very scared of her.
Well, when the Jesuits first came into our territories, they were writing about the women being the firebrands of hell. I keep repeating this in so many of these interviews because it's so amazing. So they would target the women, but they came here knowing how to do that. So obviously, they had good practice and worked out that system of patriarchy takeover.
But it is important to notice that there were until she got to the judges who persecuted her at the end. And for sure, that was misogynist and motivated by misogyny. But, the men captains who fought with her, they respected her. And that there were people in the church who supported her too. So it was a complicated world, but she had many supporters and friends who really admired her, and accepted that she cross-dressed. That's another thing. People often say, oh, well, she was condemned because the church condemned cross-dressing. Well, those priests did, but before she got there were plenty of people who accepted it. So it was complicated. There was, as some historians talk about, the queer medieval. Joan, in a sense, belongs as a part of the queer medieval.
Oh, wow.
Very interesting way. Politically, queer in a very strong sense. So not just her clothes, but in her political sense as well.
Well, look forward to that book coming out. That should be great. I did want to mention, too, that you might be interested. So we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, right? And there are a lot of planned. And one of the things that we've been working on at the Scano Center actually is this Smithsonian exhibit that's traveling called Voices and Votes. That is sort of a celebration of American democracy. It's very red, white, and blue, and it's this traveling exhibit. And the Museum Association of New York, which is managing this for the Smithsonian, is specifically selected the Scano Center as one of the sites that they want to have this Voices and Votes exhibit in. And the reason is because there's no mention of the Haudenosaunee influence on American democracy. And so mostly Sandy and I have been involved in creating like these banners. But these banners of like talking about the influence of the Haudenosaunee,
right?
The Great Law of Peace.
We get 4 banners to accompany the tour.
Yeah, these kind of pull-up
supplemental, addendum to
so
history.
And so it's going to be in 12 different places around New York State. It's already like in Tennessee and other places. But so what we're doing is not pushing back, but I'd say supplementing that narrative, that kind of myth history that we all have to deal with.
We're pushing a little.
Yeah, we're pushing quite hard. But from this point of view that, this didn't just jump out of the heads of these white guys fully formed, 250 years ago or whatever. They were putting together, kind of modeling different ideas that of Haudenosaunee, but also other confederacies around what's now the United States. So this has pretty much been proven in a variety of ways in George Washington papers and things like that. So we're lifting some of these quotes right out of American history, and it's like this. We have to grapple with our own myth history too, right? Not just Joan of Arc's, but it's like,
absolutely,
like how do we push back? I think we're pretty well positioned in religious studies to think mythically and to think, how we can re-narrate this story of America and all that. Yeah.
Right. The local historical association sent out the first draft for each banner, and they had to be nearly completely rewritten.
Yeah.
Using things like the Onondaga had to cede their territories to, Washington, and so not exactly, still on unceded lands, right. And so it had to be its whole envisioning of this project. So it was interesting.
Yeah, we don't know how it's going to, but if it lands in a town near you, just know that you've got these other kind of supplemental banners that we've been on. Maybe it's already in Indiana. I don't really know.
I don't know.
It's going all over the place.
Our banners aren't ready yet, though. They're final.
Almost.
Yeah, they're just
Almost.
about ready to go.
Yeah.
As we get this, our own Indigenous Studies project, off the ground, we should find some ways to talk together. It's being led by my colleague Michael Ng, who's a Native Hawaiian and who's working on Native Hawaiian histories and philosophies and issues, and my colleague Alexis McLeod, who's working with some Mayan elders in the Yucatan. So very much one of the objects of our center is to talk about America as a hemispherical project and not just to really push against limiting the America to the U.S. borders.
Thanks.
And obviously the Haudenosaunee and the Onondaga are way ahead of us on that. I know.
Well, we're fortunate. We're fortunate to be here. I mean, it's not like, so, we used to live in Missouri and Chicago. I grew up in Michigan, really didn't know anything about, indigenous peoples there, in fact, when we were in Missouri, we discovered that it was illegal in terms of the state constitution, illegal for Native Americans to actually reside in Missouri. Because they'd all been removed, or that was the fiction that they were operating under. So the Midwest is a strange place. There you are in Indiana, and then, and then, what does that mean? Can just kind of start there. But we're fortunate in New York, oddly enough, to be located near, one of the last or few federally recognized Native American nations that do not have a Bureau of Indian Affairs government on their territory. They've resisted that. They have their own passports. They stick to this kind of sovereignty narrative, and so in a way it's easy, in a way it's difficult because they're very mistrustful of people just generally, but we've been able to
very protective.
Very protective.
Maybe it's a better word.
Yeah, that's right. You're right.
I got to see one of those passports when we were in Japan together. You may remember.
Oh, that's right. Gosh, that was like 2005. Something like that. That's right. Yeah. So we're fortunate in a way, and we with the Scano Center we're able to share some of that. They explicitly so they're not interested in sharing their language. They've got all the language programs and those kind of revitalization programs going on at the nation, but at Onondaga Lake they wanted this to be much more of a public kind of effort that pushes out their story, to others, all kinds of others. So yeah, it makes it a little bit easier than other territories like, that are surviving.
They're united on the front. They don't have a competing BIA government that silences their traditional people, which was the case at Standing Rock. The BIA leadership was not really entirely supportive of what the traditional people were trying to accomplish there and stopping the pipeline.
It's a long story.
So there's great clarity here at Onondaga. They know who they are and they speak with a united voice.
Yeah,
it's unique.
So I'll be very interested in what you're doing there, Winnie, at your center. It's very, very interesting. I got a better sense of it in this conversation. So.
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation and great to see you too. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
The producers of this podcast were Adam DJ Brett and Jordan Lon Cologne. Our intro and outro is Social Dancing Music by Oris Edwards and Regis Cook. This podcast is funded in collaboration with the Henry Luce Foundation, Syracuse University, and Hendricks Chapel, and the Indigenous Values Initiative. If you like this episode, please check out our website and make sure to subscribe.